We talked about scenarios, we talked about uncertainty and all these very overwhelming things. First, to get a more constructive perspective on the futures, we need to understand what change is happening and contextualize that. And that's kind of the reason for building this Megatrends framework, is to contextualize that change that we're all seeing around us, but that we don't have like a grasp on, because it's one day you hear about Trump, the next day about climate dread, the third day about AI, and it's like all these things are being thrown at you, but we need to kind of take a moment to just get an overview of what is it that we're looking into. I was born in a place where most rich people live in Denmark, and then I moved to this island where I've been lucky to be brought up amongst all sorts of different people from all different types of lives, and seeing the effects of decisions on them, and not always being included in those decisions. Not maybe something I only realized later on, that this is kind of something I brought with me, trying to have empathy for those that are different and trying to understand where people come from instead of distancing yourself. And I think that aligns very well with the notion of future studies or foresight, that essentially needs to be a participatory process, because if we need to change, we need to change together. We need to be part of that change as well. I think we have so much potential. I think it's super interesting how we act as if we're rational, but we're not rational at all, and don't understand fully what it means to be human in that sense. It's a kind of constant philosophical discussion on what it means to be human, what should we do, what's our role and responsibility, and all this. But essentially, I think that most people want to do good for other people, because we're social creatures, which have a tendency of moving society forward, mostly at large, and we've been seeing that over the years, right? We have progressed over time. But also I think we're forgetting sometimes is that we're very resilient, we're very adaptive, and that's also part of who we are. We're actually really good at responding to change, even though it's very uncomfortable for us to think of. It takes a lot of awareness that it's actually possible to dream up, or to envision a different society than what we're living in. I think a lot of people just disregard straight away that it's possible to live in a different world than what we do right now, forgetting that things have changed over time again and again and again. We cannot afford to stop dreaming. I think that's also a critical part, and we need to keep imagining better futures, because otherwise, what's the point, really? The one thing I always ask myself in interviews is that what's the one uncomfortable question you haven't asked yourself, that you don't want to ask yourself, but that actually is what you need to ask yourself.
Can I ask which one would that be? Hi, and welcome back to New World in the Making. Today we're joined by Mathias, who works in strategic foresight and futures thinking, fields that ask not just where we're headed, but who we are in shaping that direction. We explore 8 megatrends he's identified, what megatrends really are, and how they help us navigate all the complexity. But the conversation goes deeper into agency, imagination, and the idea that emerging futures aren't fixed destinies, but invitations into looking into ourselves and beyond. Mathias brings an honest, very grounded lens to the questions he's sitting with, and invites us all to be brief and ask the comfortable questions we all might have there. Let's dive in. Thanks, Mathias, for joining. I'm very excited for our conversation, because there's so much I want to know. But yeah, we always start a little bit more into the personal background story. So if you could share a little bit how you came to the place you're in right now. Why strategic foresight?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Adriana. I think it's really nice concept you're working on here, and I think that's a very big question, actually. I met a lot of people who came into the field from different directions. Mine was basically, originally I wanted to be an anthropologist, so I always found it interesting to study people and their behavior, why they do as they do, behavioral change over time, and so on, right? So, but being an anthropologist can be quite limiting in some ways as well, because you're kind of confined to what the people do. And I found myself on a kind of an educational journey through business and culture and a bit of innovation. So I kind of understanding the practicalities of how we act and how we do things in the world and how we create new things and are creative and really improve things on a broad level. And as chance happens, I was a bit late in applying for internships back in my master's degree, and I came across this wild place. I never heard of something like this before, but it's called the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies. And I was like, what on earth is future studies? And when I read the description, the kind of the epic of the internship posting, I thought, well, why are they describing me that well, right? It's like about being curious, about being analytical, about also being imaginative. Um, it's about, understanding what's happening around us, both the people, but also the broader context we find ourselves in. And yeah, I just thought, I would be perfect for this position. So I applied, and I was very lucky to be chosen back in the day as one of the 4 interns. And so the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies is a not-for-profit think tank. So they both do think tank work, like knowledge pieces and research, but also do consultancy work. And I found myself very comfortable with this. I kind of had realized that consultancy might be interesting for me because it's about tackling problems, about solving problems for different types of clients. It's a lot of variation, which I enjoy, and then combining it with this discipline that I then found out contains so much, which is Foresight, was just a perfect match. And now, we're 7, 8 years in of me having done this now with my own agency, and I can't imagine doing anything else, to be honest.
So fascinating. And can you, because I always find myself going back also to the question of anthropology and like also what kind of idea of humankind do we have as a society, as a culture? What kind of idea do you personally have?
Around society at large, I think it's very much kind of the foundations from for that perspective comes from my upbringing in a sense, because I grew up on a small island called Bornholm, which is in the Baltic Sea. And if you're not German, if not Danish, maybe Swedish, you probably haven't heard of it, right? So it's like this is like so lonely island in the middle of the Baltic Sea. Very beautiful, and like the nature is amazing. I usually call it the Mallorca of Denmark because it's beautiful nature. It's very sunny compared to the rest of Denmark, and there's a lot of Germans in the summer. So it's like the perfect metaphor. But I grew up on this small island, right? So it's you can't take a university degree. You can't really, if you want to work with knowledge in some way or form, that's not the place to be. Of course, there are companies and there are different industries that are quite well functioning. But you have to look outside, right? And that's also, I think, the Danish approach very much. We always have to look outside our own little confined context for inspiration. And I think the essential idea that I work from, coming from a place like that, is that everyone should have a say in decisions that apply to them, right? I think that fundamentally is important. That's why I speak a lot about democracy and democratization of futures, because I've seen people from all sorts of different like aspects of life. I was born in a place where most rich people live in Denmark, and then I moved to this island where I've been lucky to be brought up amongst all sorts of different people from all different like types of lives, and seeing the effects of decisions on them, and not always being included in those decisions. I've been not maybe something I only realized later on, that this is kind of something I brought with me, trying to have empathy for those that are different and trying to understand where people come from instead of distancing yourself. And I think that aligns very well with the notion of future studies or foresight, that essentially needs to be a participatory process, because if we need to change, we need to change together. We need to be part of that change as well.
So, so interesting because, yeah, I guess the upbringing always shapes us very much, and all the different influences of cultures. So, would you say you have a positive outlook on the human species. Like, have you read this book, Humankind?
No, but I read other work by Rutger Bregman, I think his name is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, no, I agree to a large extent that I'm very much optimistic on behalf of people. I think it's also, since I wanted to be an anthropologist, right? It's like it's something I find fascinating. I think we have so much potential. I think it's super interesting how we act as if we're rational, but we're not rational at all, and don't understand fully what it means to be human in that sense. It's a kind of constant, like, philosophical discussion on what it means to be human, what should we do, what's our role and responsibility, and all this. But essentially, I think that most people want to do good for other people because we're social creatures, which have a tendency of moving society forward, mostly at large, and we've been seeing that over the years, right? We have progressed over time. Of course, there are indications of the opposite sometimes, and sometimes we take 2 steps back and maybe then 3 steps forward afterwards. Yeah, so I'm generally optimistic on behalf of people, and at the moment, I'm very much fascinated by the notion of breakthroughs, because we talk about breakdowns of the climate, of the economy, of the politics and polarization, all these very, very big movements, right? But I think there's a lot of potential speaking about the things that are actually improving our lives on a daily basis that are maybe being overlooked continuously, because there are many people who are working towards creating better futures for more people. And I think that's worth like shedding a light on as well.
No, I 100% agree. That's why also this is the podcast for that. There's a space for this there. I loved also your recent LinkedIn post where you're sharing about realism and how you were called an idealist, right? And I loved that post because I was like, well, I honestly encountered a few of those situations myself, and I was just, resonating a lot with that post.
I really appreciate it.
How did that happen?
I was a bit unsure whether to share about being called an idealist, because for me it's something that I never heard. I had never thought of myself in that way. I never heard anyone describe me in that way. I always see myself as very much a pragmatist, and like trying to make things work as good as possible. But as I've come to realize, the way I speak sometimes have a kind of a connotation of being almost an evangelist of, of some sort, and I think there's no harm in trying to be hopeful and be optimistic about the futures. I think instead I try to see it as like a source of pride that I actually have something that I believe in, right? And it's not something I ever thought about before. This person called me idealist, and I was suddenly had to realize and said, and try to understand myself better, and what is it that's driving this. Why am I striving towards certain goals, and there's like I have a mission what I'm doing, which is maybe not intentional in the first place, but maybe it was more of a subconscious kind of carrying out of who I actually am in reality.
And would you say that you had to go through radical inner shifts to do this work? Were there any challenges as well?
Yeah, I think I've had to do that ever, like always. When I was young, like a child, and grew up and like went to primary school, I was very shy and very much the nerdy kid, trying to fit in some ways, but also trying to sticking out because I felt always like this inner confidence. But over time, my identity has changed to become who I am today. And especially in the last 2 years since I founded Anticipate, I've come to see myself in very new light. I never thought I would be an entrepreneur. Like that was never in my plans. I even studied entrepreneurship, and still it was never something that really came up as a career option. My parents are both used to work in the public sector. My dad used to be a policeman when he worked, and my mom worked in an office in the judicial system. So it's not something that comes natural for me or my person to take risk. At least so I thought. Right? And being an entrepreneur is about taking risk. It's about starting things, about getting things done. Um, so I think that my identity has shifted in the sense that I've become more aware of who I am, and what I can do and what I can't do alone as well. Also because when I started Anticipate, when I left the Copenhagen Institute of Future Studies, a lot of my identity was tied to that place because it's a special place. you're calling yourself futurist. That's amazing, right? That's one of the most impressive job titles in essence, and what you can do. And then when I started to anticipate, the world was kind of all of a sudden very open to me. What should I do? Who should I be? What do I want to communicate? And actually, at the first 2 weeks, since I started Anticipate 2 years ago, I was just lying on the couch. I couldn't move at all. Almost, I was just like hit by this very sudden anxiety about the openness of the world, and a non-healthy relationship with the future, you might say. So that actually has also had an impact of who I've become afterwards, because I've been realizing some of the unhealthy ways of thinking about the future that I've brought with me throughout my years. Yeah, so I would say my identity is very much constantly changing as well.
Well, that's so interesting. What would you say are those unhealthy ways that we think of the future? Because I think a lot of people, and myself included, can relate from time to time. Like I'm like, oof, super panicked, and then like, okay, let's look into this.
Yeah, I understand that, because the world is overwhelming. If you start peeking a bit like into the future, it seems all these things that are happening right now, we can basically almost only imagine them going worse. It's very much easy to imagine negative futures, because it's about the present and the bad situations and just extrapolating on those and really ending in disaster. But historically, we almost always have an equilibrium, right? So we've been able to shift back into more of a positive outlook. During World War II, for example, let's say that, right? People didn't know how long this war was going to last, when it was going to end, what was going to come afterwards. They also probably had a very negative outlook on the future, and then things changed. The good side won, and maybe even people and I think people even in Germany, for example, felt relieved. Of course, there were some immediate concerns, but the longer term perspectives look better for them in that sense. And I think, that's been happening over time, and we're not really alone. I think that's also what happens when we talk about the future with everyone else, that we get to understand that there are different ways of viewing what could happen. And I think that's a very calming thought in some ways, that, okay, my idea of the future is not necessarily what's going to be correct. It's not the only one. There are many others out there like me. I think an unhealthy pattern is to constantly worry. I've been like a chronic worrier myself, in a sense, very much thinking about a lot of different scenarios that have very little probability. I think, it can be helpful in a certain way, but not if you're constantly being hit by these impressions all the time. From the outside, also things you can't control. I think I've learned to try to control the things I can control, and then be a bit more open about what's happening around me. Still a work in progress, I would say, but I think it's very much back to some of the old ways of thinking in terms of stoicism, perhaps a bit, and being able to look at what you can actually move, what's actually affecting you, trying to be more constructive in your way of looking at the future and what is happening. And that's why, for example, I developed the Megatrends framework, because I think I had a tendency to meet people on a more advanced level of futures thinking, so to speak. We talked about scenarios, we talked about uncertainty and all these very overwhelming things. But first, to get a more constructive perspective on the futures, we need to understand what change is happening and contextualize that. And that's kind of the reason for building this megatrends framework, is to contextualize that change that we're all seeing around us, but that we don't have like a grasp on, because it's one day you hear about Trump, the next day about climate threat, the third day about AI, and it's like all these things are being thrown at you, but we need to kind of take a moment to just get an overview of what is it that we're looking into here.
No, I love that. And in a second, we're going to go into that, because those 8 mega trends are just magnificent. And I love to look into that. But why do you think that is, that we always project something negative into the future?
I don't know. I think it's very human that we always had to worry about risks. Even like our biological brains are wired to think about risk, and even change is part of it's part of the brain that also controls the fear or flight, or like the So I think it's something we're wired to do, because it's better to be safe and protect ourselves against harm than it's about thinking about potentialities that might be more positive for us, right? So I think it's just a natural part of being human that we are, existentially worried as a species, because that's how we've been used to. And to think of it, hasn't been that long that. And I know now we speak for a certain part of the world, of course, it's not everywhere, but that we're relatively safe in many parts of the world from basic, in terms of basic survival. We have climbed the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, again, in many places, not everywhere. And but we're still concerned what will happen if that's pulled away from us. But also I think we're forgetting sometimes is that we're very resilient, we're very adaptive, and that's also part of who we are. Really good at like changing if something happens to us, and out of nowhere, right? We are resourceful, and some places more than others as well. And I think that is something we need to get back to, in that sense that we're actually really good at responding to change, even though it's very uncomfortable for us to think of. Um,
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And it's also, I guess, a catalyst for us to keep evolving and growing, right? Could you maybe walk us through these 8 mega trends, since we already talked about them?
yeah, for sure. I think they're not going to come as a shock to anyone. Maybe a couple of them will be a bit surprising, the angle we've chosen to focus on in that sense. But basically, we've been together with a couple of other people, some of my regular collaborators. We've been trying to kind of define what could be a nice, kind of like on equal terms level of megatrends, because there are a lot of megatrends out there, and many different people have different ideas of what it is. But for me and for us, it's these global forces of change that is impacting people everywhere. Of course, it looks different depending on whether you're in India or in Denmark, right? But you're being affected by these still in your daily life. So the 8 megatrends are emerging world order, basically how we're seeing geopolitical shifts. We're moving away from a unipolar world order where the US had control. It's a more multipolar world, more regionalization, more tension than we've been used to globally. So that's the first one. The second one is urban transformation. So basically how cities are vehicles and engines of innovation and change, and very fast and rapid change. We even see mega cities and people moving to cities to pursue new opportunities in life. What does that mean for like the life of an urban citizen? And we're also leaving some people behind in rural areas where there's less focus because there's less people. And even with climate change, I think that's an interesting aspect. How does that play out in cities? Then there's optimizing health. So the whole longevity discussion, both we have been living longer and better lives in general than we did, 200 years ago, even 20 years ago. The rise of non-communicable diseases have been a new game changer in terms of what's threatening us. But also all the aspects of technology that can serve to bring us better lives, right? I think that's where some of these breakthroughs really shine through. That we actually, some people even talk about death as something we can avoid potentially down the line, and I think that's a fascinating, slightly scary thought from an existential perspective, but also
Yeah.
very interesting challenge to bring in. How do we kill death? For example, I was at a conference recently where that was a topic actually. Um, then the fourth one is liquid lifestyles, which has caused a bit of, in some ways, attention, because this is something that's happening very differently across very different geographies and generations. But in essence, it's that like smoothing out, and also diversification still of how we live and how we work, how different generations interact. You know, some of these trends around how we want to pursue different lifestyles than our parents used to have. That's happening both in East Asia and in the US, and also some places in the global south, that we're actually seeing that there's a different way of viewing things. And I think COVID brought a lot of this realization to us. Also, in a counter trend, you might say that there also is a move back towards some of the more traditional aspects, conservatism, which is very fascinating, that counter movement as well in the search for meaning of life. Like, what's the meaning of life in essence? And that's different for everyone. But some people seek back to some of the more traditionalist appeal, and other people are pursuing new ways and trying to express themselves differently. Yes. And then there's number 5, which is maybe one of the ones that's the bit of confusion around what it actually means, but I think this is maybe one of the most critical ones, and it's blurring realities. So how our realities is very much in many ways subjective, and it's also being in some ways manipulated consciously and subconsciously by some people who have intentions around what they do, and perhaps even good intentions around creating better lives. But also misinformation and very like weaponization of information that is really changing our outlook on things, because we have access to a lot of information more than ever before, and with the click of a button or on our phones that we have in our pockets, which is pretty fascinating technology, to be honest. But we also are exposed to much wrong information, and like being able to critically assess what's right and what's wrong, what's right for the individual, what's truth and trust. What does that mean? Do we trust our neighbor? Do we trust people who think differently than us? I think that's one of the really, really big drivers that are maybe more on an underlying level, changing the make of society. Also in a place like Denmark, where trust has been part of why we've become the country we are now. Like, what does that mean for the future when perhaps we are not able to, trust that something is real or that it's with good intentions in place? And maybe very much related to those two mega trends, we have artificial revolution, and I don't have to even mention what it means. I think that we're seeing AI take over, and I think we're still very much in the early days. And the thing is that it seems that ChatGPT and OpenAI kind of kickstarted a whole new process, and they did in many ways in terms of the public awareness of what this is and what the tools can do and investments and so on. But this is a movement that's been going on for decades, right? So the access to AI on a personal level has just been opened up, and we're seeing already what that can change in terms of, the graying a bit of, social media posts and of who we are, and our emails and our ways of doing things are becoming kind of this like muddy, gray, similar pool of stuff. But eventually, it will also be a way to kind of express our personalities in different ways, because we are looking into a future where we might have our own very, very specifically adjusted agentic AI that will act on behalf of us, even almost as like a digital twin in AI form. So I think that's an interesting development to follow. I think we're not even there yet. People talk about super intelligence as well. How we will have AI that's actually almost conscious to a human level. And I think it's very interesting we're making this technology in as a replication of ourselves. And I think that's what's different from other technologies, that this is actually something that's meant to replace people. Whereas in the former industrial revolutions, it's been technologies that has like been able to, at some levels, replace us at the factory lines, or the computer and so on. It's been an extension of ourselves, it's been tools, but this is actually an attempt to this replace us on a more human level of our intelligence, which is our brains is very much the essence of who we are. Some would argue, at least. So I think it's fascinating to follow, and of course, there's a lot of talk out there about this. Yeah. No, yeah. I'm just rambling on with the with the Megatrends, but
After this, we're gonna dive into each of them because I'm just so interested and I have so many questions. Okay, please continue.
And yeah, then number 7 is collapsing ecosystems and climate change in a different package, you might call it. But there is so much more to it. You might even call it like the degradation of nature. Our relationship with nature also being very separate. We are made out of nature, but we have kind of forgotten that as we have come to have less use and less direct. Again, the whole moving to cities have moved us away from nature. What does that mean? What does it mean when we're destroying ecosystems at a faster pace than ever in a ways we haven't really foreseen or can even think about what the consequences are, because this is the large scale ramifications, right? We're talking about you driving your car to work that potentially has an effect on whether the Gulf Stream is gonna reverse or cool down in a sense. So it's like it's very far removed, but still very real. And the two of us just talked before we went on the podcast about how summers are gonna get warmer in many places. I'm complaining about the Danish weather now, but maybe in 10 years, I'll actually be happy that we have 15 degrees and rain, because that might be a more rare occurrence. The thing is, we're damaging things on a daily basis that are very difficult. It's very difficult to replace. I do believe there's cause for optimism as well, because there are a lot of people working on creating systemic solutions against all the deterioration we'll see, but it will be worse before it might get better at the end of the line. That's at least something I believe in, that we will find ways around it. The question is, will we do it in time to avoid the large-scale destruction of our natural habitats, or will we be able to reverse it sooner? I think we have a lot of tools at our disposal to do it if we really want to. The question is if there's the willingness to drive this change. And yeah, then the final megatrend is wealth polarization. And perhaps for me, and this for some people it might sound like a Danish perspective. We talk about it, equal society. People are supposed to have like equal say and be like similar. But I think this is the social structures of society is changing a lot, right? That the fact that we have some people might have the same amount of money, but other people having like 100 times that. That's not a healthy way to organize society in any way. It's not good for the wealthy people. It's not good for the people who don't have as much either. So I think that's a really big problem, that we're seeing this fragmentation, this polarization of wealth that is controlled in very few people's hands. Um, because it's not about the very liberal way of thinking, oh yeah, the trickle down effect and all of this. It's more about, if you don't see any opportunity for your life to improve at some point, because some people are accumulating the wealth, there will be a lot of frustration, and of course the worsening perhaps of people's lives that might cause even increased frictions. And I think that's what we're seeing right now, politically speaking. We can talk about how social media came in and the financial crisis and so on. I think very much the ripple effects of the financial crisis of 2008 are still being seen in this way, that we're hearing talks about the economy being better on a national, a global level every day. Like some companies like quadrupling their sizes and the money they have, but still people's lives are not markedly different. And that's a new kind of tension that's emerging. And of course, there's been a differentiation between poor and wealthy people before, but now it's more on a structural, systemic level that's been happening. And I think it's even from generation to generation. We're talking about this generation, young people being worse off than their parents' generation. And I think that's a very misunderstood or misguided. Perhaps it's due to misguided policies to kind of account for making life better in general for people, that it's ended up like this. And I think it's something very difficult again to see themselves out of, because who will be willing to give away what they have already? And so I think you might see some kind of clash on a bigger level at some point in this regard, not just politically and voting and all this, but on a more societal level. But there's also cause for hope. A lot of people being brought out of poverty on a daily basis, and the global middle class is growing as well. So there are potentials to change this.
Quick question on the wealth polarization, because I feel it also connects with the emerging world order in some way. It's kind of like closing the loop. Why do you think, I mean, you already mentioned the financial crisis. Why do you think we have, and the trend is going towards even more polarization and that imbalance?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, I think what we saw was that some people are protected no matter what they have done to society. they're protected and other people are losing their jobs. Or, and I put on a very generalistic level, in the US, we've been seeing factory workers will lose their jobs, and it's not that they need to get it back like Trump wants. He wants, so yeah, let's put all the American workers who don't have jobs right now, put them back into factories, because they don't want that. They've kind of moved beyond that lifestyle in a sense, right? So I think it's more structurally. I think we've reached a point in time where our productivity is high enough that we actually can afford to have some people work less or work different lives, or being a bit open our work life models a bit up to see that, right? We're working the same amount of hours across at least the Western world as we did 4 years ago, nearly the same amount of hours. And I think that's not really the way to go move forward when we've been seeing all this productivity increases. So all this, of course, we've been getting wealthier and lives are better again on the Western world, mainly, right? But also other parts of the world. But not on the level that we should have seen with the productivity, right? 40 years ago, you barely had a computer at your disposal, right? You had to send letters to people to get anything done. You have to have meetings via phone, right? Of course, but also in person, travel around, go somewhere. And it doesn't make any sense that we're stuck in the same system, the same paradigm from that time. So I think, and as always, what's happening is that politics follow behind the changes in society. And I think that's what we've been seeing in many ways, that our logics, societal logics, is still stuck in the way that are just not relevant for anymore, and life is accelerating on many parameters, and we're still not trying to keep up. We're trying to break the system down and try to build it up, but not nearly at the level that we need to think about redesigning it and make it better for more people. I don't know, it's it's a very fundamental, and I think there's a lot of reasons for this fundamental issue, but that some people have been able to take advantage of, because that's what happens, right? If you feel you're disenfranchised, you feel frustrated, you're looking for alternatives, and the only alternatives is standing out and promising you everything you want. Of course, you're gonna trust what they say, right? It's very difficult not to, and to be critical in that position, because something has happened that has made your life worse, and you need someone to blame. You need someone to come and take you out of this mess. At least the belief that someone will help you.
And connecting that to the emerging world order, how do you see that whole US, China, you know, emerging countries, the global south, do you think it's going to evolve a little bit into more equal, just having a little bit more equal opportunities, or what do you see the trends are?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting and a bit ironic that the US has spent the last 80 years trying to be the policeman of the world, and have used it to their advantage to really claim like a strong power global level. They have made the dollar the norm financially, and then right now they're breaking everything down they've built, because they feel like they've been wrong. But they've built the system themselves, right? And of course, this is the making of a few people who have a certain strategy around it. But I think that's very ironic, and I think they're right on some levels, that have been a very clear strategy from other countries and other parts of the world to really stake a claim in the future. And I think, coming back to the whole aspect of, future studies and foresight, some countries have actually had the foresight to see where is the world moving, how can we stake a bigger claim in where things are going. In the US, they've left it very much up to the private sector, which can do a lot of work, of course, innovation, and there are very powerful, these big companies, right? But there are other countries where it's been a more of like a conscious strategy on their part to say, okay, well, how can we claim a bigger role, build our economies, and and on a more like longer term time horizon as well, on a long time horizon, 50, 100 years from now. China has a 100-year strategy. It's not, they're not thinking about the next 4 years. Of course, that's also because the political system is different, but I think that's what we're maybe not seeing, the failings of democracy, because democracy is supposed to be messy and supposed to be slow to like really think things out, think things through. It doesn't always appear that way, but that's kind of the intention with it as well. But there are also the limitations sometimes, that you don't have the power to actually just carry out whatever change you want. And I think it's not so much that democracies fail. I think we just fail to see the right visions from our democratic leaders and saying what is it actually we're striving towards, not just like small optimizations, but really like having that big picture thinking, saying like 30 years from now, where do we want to stand as a country? What industries should we focus on? How do we want to, for example, in Denmark, reinvigorate the welfare state in a country where more people are going to be above 60, right? So we're seeing aging societies, and that's been something we've been able to see coming for many years. But have people in power really thought about this? Have they reflected on what we can do differently now? I doubt it, and position themselves in the right way for that change to happen. I think they've lacked the foresight, to be honest. A lot of the Western leaders, democracy, no democracy, to say, okay, we actually need to have a strategy for where we want to take the country. And, leadership might change, but if the strategy is good enough, I think you would find different parties in the same country fighting for it, or like fighting for the same vision eventually. Maybe that's again the idealist in me speaking, but I feel like that's part of the shortcoming of what we've seen. And you've been seeing also countries in the global south or in between trying to really say, how can we position ourselves? Who can we collaborate with? Be more pragmatic in that way. Whereas we've held like a certain value system we wanted to carry out and expose the rest of the world to. I think it's nice that you think your values are better. I'm also born out of this tradition that democratic values are the best and we need to listen to everyone and all this, but maybe we haven't really tried to fully understand what we're working with here.
That's so interesting. And what do you think? How does AI enter into that whole equation? Do you think at some point AI is gonna govern in some ways? How is that also affecting our jobs? In your Megatrend report, you said 40 to 80% are going to be affected of the jobs are going to be affected by AI. How do you see that?
Hmm. And I think having worked with people in big organizations and companies and so on, they're still scrambling for ways to work around AI, right? It's something that's developing and seen as still a new technology. It's like a hammer you're trying to solve problems with, not the kind of the nail that really will like focus and help you focus on the specific things. So people are still scrambling for ways of working with this. But yeah, I think essentially what's really interesting here is that there's been this consensus that no one has really disagreed to, that AI will just be the dominant factor. We need to develop AI because it increases our productivity and efficiency, and then no one has cared to stop and ask themselves. Of course, maybe there's some regulators somewhere that have been a bit more, is this all good, or are we just doing this because it seems like the only future we can envision? I think that's sometimes the question we need to ask ourselves. And we always talk about AI like it's like a predetermined aspect of society, right? Oh yeah, we need to do this because of X, Y, Z, and there are a lot of reasons for doing it, but we don't really take the moment to stop and say, okay, what do we need to replace AI with? Of course, it's difficult when you can't collaborate across borders and different approaches and to this way of thinking in China and the US and in Europe and around global South, right? It's also a big democratizing factor. You're actually able to do and do things on a much bigger scale with much less than you were before. So in that way, it's great. But I think we need to be more intentional. That's all I'm saying. Yeah, 40 to 80%. That's also showing a bit. So that's different forecasts that have been determining that, right? And I think even back when I started with Foresight 7-8 years ago, we used a study from McKinsey saying 40% by 2025. And I don't think that's true. That hasn't been true. That's why forecast needs to be complemented with other things. But it's just to say that this is something that can impact a lot of jobs and lives in at a scale we maybe even haven't seen yet. But it's also something that we need to be conscious around. What is it that we want to replace? What kind of human jobs are not, particularly interesting for people to do? How do they want to use it? Not just mindlessly asking ChatGPT everything and every question they can come to think of, but yeah. But the thing is, it's an invisible kind of factor and becoming part of our systems in many ways that we don't even notice. Like I asked my mom if she had tried to use ChatGPT, and she said no. She hadn't tried it. She heard a lot of things. And I said, well, but you use Gemini, because if you Google something right now, you'll get Gemini's, Google's AI level, like version of what it is you want to find out, right? So you're already being exposed to it, even though you don't notice it, because you're just being told an answer. And I think that's where we need to have a lot more critical thinking in society, and intentionality around what we want to use AI for and what we don't want to use it for.
And because what you were saying earlier as well, that AI essentially is a technology that is made to replace us, not as an extension tool. So how do you see it as, okay, if it's going to impact these jobs, and maybe even less, but maybe it's going to replace our jobs, how do we have a society that is still functioning? Do you see UBI in that equation, universal basic income? Do you see other economic systems? Do you see maybe that through AI, maybe things are going to go and get cheaper? Maybe we're going to have a very centralized AI system. I don't know. I see a lot of different scenarios. Maybe can you give us a little bit of your opinion on where we're heading?
I think it's going to be very different depending on where you are, but it's very hard to try to imagine a society where we don't have it at our disposal. And perhaps it was meant as an extension of ourselves, but I just think it's very clearly trying to replicate, or like replace some of the things that we are trying to do by replication, in essence. So it's learning from how we do things, and in that as way trying to do things better. Potentially not even needing us anymore, right? But I think, yeah, it's a tough question. I'm not a doomer in any way, and I don't see our societies like dwindling or anything in the short or near term or the next 50, 100 years even. But that is a risk, of course, that we won't be needed anymore in essence. Yeah, but that's the very dark side of it. I think what we need to find back to is what's really human, and is our curiosity, our ingenuity, our like creativity, our ways of combining things. And yeah, I think, what are essentially human aspects. I think that's a conversation, meeting people eye to eye, face to face, and understanding empathy, for example. I think that's going to be hard to train an AI on. Of course, you can replicate it again, but that whole humanitarian aspect of it is difficult. Yeah, we probably need a new societal system. The question is whether that will come naturally as something we slowly over time adapt to, or it will be changed by some kind of disaster that makes us wake up in a certain sense of like realize that we need to do things differently. I think, of course, it makes sense in some ways to have universal basic income, at least like to create like a level based playing field for everyone in terms of also the wealth polarization. As long as it doesn't become like a sleeping like a pillow for resting on, like in that way. And I think it's a difficult sell still, like how should the model work and so on. Maybe we will have to figure out a system that is not driven by progress and by growth necessarily, but just by well-being. How do we create the best lives for people? I think that's a fundamentally different way of looking at the systems we created, and it hasn't really been present for for several hundred years. This way of thinking, that what's the purpose of life, the meaning of life, isn't that to have the best life possible? How do we create that? Is it to consume endlessly? Is it to have safety, have a roof over your head? What does it really mean, right? And I think that's fundamentally what we need to get back to. What's the best life for each person?
And what would you say on a personal level? What would be that for you?
That's a good question. Yeah. Um, for me, like I no, I like to get like, for me, I love like getting new ideas and being able to like carry them out and see them come to fruition and build things, which AI is great for as well. Like I've just built two different apps in 1-2 hours each that might first of all, I don't have the skills to do it, right? So it helps me pull together those those skills that I don't have at my disposal, but also giving me something quick that I can see and actually feel, and that I can show to people and say, this interesting, maybe it can spark some interest and inspiration. And I think, yeah, for me, it's like I'm motivated by like coming up with ideas and carrying them out, but also like pursuit of knowledge, of learning new things, of becoming better at what I do, becoming a better person as well. So I think those are some of the things that motivates me. Yeah, and perhaps even consider the whole mindfulness aspect of things. That's not something I've considered too much. I think it's part of the root of anticipation, which is what I've named my company Anticipate after, right? To anticipate is to kind of foresee what could happen, but also to be rooted in a certain state of being comfortable with whatever is gonna emerge, right? Um, yeah. So I think it's a very difficult, difficult question. What's the meaning of life for me? What do I want to do? What about you?
I think I'm always evolving towards that question, and it's always changing as well. But I think growing consciousness and evolving towards that, and I think that is always grounding me to like, okay, how are we growing consciousness in this and awareness, and to be at peace inside, and then that makes everything so much easier, and that connects me with myself, with others, with nature, with like everything. And yeah, and like getting more into here and less here in the the worry brain and all that, and more into connecting to what I feel. But yeah, it's a tough question, and I think then how that manifests, I think that changes a lot throughout your life, how, in what way you do that. And I think like right now this is the podcast, and this is the reason why I'm doing this. um and yeah, and it's exciting. So this is the reason, I think, for me.
Yeah, and of course it's changing, right? Maybe in 5 years I'll say to create the best lives possible for my children. I don't know if I will have children at that point, right? But yeah, it's constantly changing, and that's part of what makes life interesting as well, right? It's not stale in any way. It keeps evolving. At least for me, that makes life interesting.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. I think also it's Salim Ismail said that that we all human creatures and nature, everything always grows, and even like a tree, just it grows, right? Like no one is telling it to grow, like it just grows, and we all are going into the direction of growing. So I think it's ingrained in our nature of just wanting to grow as well. And what would you say, I don't know, going into that aspect of making it easier maybe to grow, but then having that blurry realities, but then also maybe going back into something that really makes us be grounded in our humanness? Because I read a LinkedIn post the other day where they were saying that now they appreciate when the LinkedIn post maybe has a mistake or two, to make it really visible that it's actually human written and not AI. And that the hiring process, even if you submit a cover letter and it's just there's one little mistake, it's just making things way more human, and they appreciate that. It's not like, okay, ChatGPT, just give me the cover letter. And do you think that could be a little bit our trend as well, to go into more humanness, especially with blurry realities where we don't really know what to believe anymore? Can you see that too?
Yeah, I think also the whole transparency um, aspect of it. Like, are you actually being open that you're using it? I appreciate that. Actually, it's very relevant for what I've been through a few different, maybe the dilemmas recently. Both I had to hire an intern, or I had to, but I've been hiring an intern for the fall semester. And what I noticed in those, I think I received perhaps 50 applications. first off, many of them never read the job posting because I specifically mentioned that they had to send an email to a specific email address, right? So only 20 people did that, ended up doing that out of the 50 who applied on LinkedIn before it closed. And then the people who sent the proper cover letter and the short motivation, I just asked for like a really brief one, right? So they don't have to use AI necessarily. They just have to answer two short questions. And the amount of bad AI usage I saw was kind of like, well, it was kind of sad to me. Like people, they hadn't even like sought to correct some of the things that are very obviously AI. And I think that's also something to do with AI literacy. Now I've been using it quite a lot. And again, that maybe goes a bit against my whole point and intentionality. I need to do that more myself. But I notice when things are AI written, right? And that maybe they can expect that when they send something into me, that okay, I can tell that something is. A lot of it was just blatantly, put in the job posting, put in a former like motivational letter, like a cover letter, and then let's see what it says. Not even correcting, just like small things or making it a bit more personal. And I understand you have to send a lot of applications out, but you don't improve your chances by just sending something very generic out, because that's the gray mass I'm talking about. That's what it ends up being, right? Um, and then I've had both. I was interviewed for a book, and they told me, oh yeah, you can just review a summary or like a transcript. It was actually a transcript of what you've been saying, because I was asked for that. I'd like to see what I've been saying, if anything needs to go out, right? And they just sent like a AI summary of whatever I said. Some of the things were blatantly wrong, right? It was because like the recording had misheard what I've been saying, and it was just I just thought it was very lazy. They didn't even make anything out of it. They even put it in quotation marks, and like I had said that thing, right? But it was clearly stale and without personality. It's not to say that I have this like super colorful, wild personality that needs to be encompassed in this kind of transcript. But still, I couldn't even feel it was something I had said. It could be something they had put in already, like asking like what would a futurist from Denmark say about the future, basically, and then they would get these like 4 paragraphs. So I asked them specifically, I can see that this is just something you put into ChatGPT. You just took the transcript and you ask it to do a summary, and that's what you got. And I think if that's the case, if you want to use that, fair enough, but just write that it's an AI summary of whatever transcript you had, right? Um, and I said, I don't think this is a very good way of working. But if that's what you want to do, fair enough, it's your book. And then they came back, and to be honest, the guy was really, really apologetic and very sorry. And the second version was actually more of a transcript. It was still, you can still see it was kind of polished by ChatGPT, but at least it had more of the words I actually had used in the conversation as part of it. And I think that's a problem, right? If you want to be used for something, like they want you to take the time to be interviewed or to read your application, and it needs to be a mutually trusting relationship in a way, and you give something away like that, and it's just being, the effort is minimum. Like you can even just like remove from it to small parts, change it a bit, change up the language, I don't know, just make it seem at least like you have done some effort, because otherwise, if you have spent no effort, I'm not going to spend effort on talking to someone like you another time, right? So I think that's a real problem, that if it's very obviously just done without any sort of conscious decision or like making around. I use ChatGPT to help me with write my LinkedIn post. I'm honest about that. It's not based off me just write a LinkedIn post about topic X. I have a very like comprehensive set of notes, and I also it takes time to correct it afterwards, because I want it to be like me, right? It wanted to be something I meant to say. And I think that authenticity, that's the word I was looking for before. I think that's something that's become more of a value, and being open and honest about what you do use it for and what you don't, instead of pretending like everything is just something you made yourself. I think, of course, it's also a risk, because people will think, okay, you just took 2 minutes to do that, right? Why should I care about? It's like fast food, basically, for knowledge sharing, right? You're taking longer to read it than I took to write it. I think that's like the wrong system. At least take some consideration into what you're doing, so to actually think about how you can provide value, and not just like be part of the like a mass production system that AI also is.
No, I 100% agree with you because I've I've never been naturally just so talented or skilled with um, writing skills. And thanks to ChatGPT AI, I've been able to convey really my message through text so that I could start a Substack, you know? So I was just so grateful to be able to really be able to just convey the message, you know, and just in a way that it's easy to understand so that people can engage. And um, I don't know how many hours I put in there to really first draft it and then go to ChatGPT for it to review. Is it grammatically correct? Maybe do a better transition here, you know, because I might overstep a few things and forget a few things and then just come back to it later. Like, you know, just writing skills so that I could actually reach so many people through Substack, for instance. And now this is allowing me so much more. And I'm so grateful for it. And every time that I publish an article, I put it down like under the article. I'm like, thanks to AI, I've been able to convey this message. So I'm 100% with you. I think we totally need to be transparent with this. And also use it intentionally as a tool and not as fast food. I love that.
Yes, empty calories, right? Isn't that what they say in a way? And yeah, I think that's very nice of you to like. I think that's also shows the democratization. It really the power it has of democratization, right? Because we are at a natural disadvantage when we communicate in English, but it's not a natural language. So I think in that way, it's fair if you do it under certain circumstances, and it's not, mindlessly passing something else on, right? Of course, there's all the ethical aspects of what it's been trained on and all the climate consequences it has and all of this, but in reality, it is a great technology that I think people should also try to use in ways that make sense for them. At least try it out. I know that many people still haven't tried, like, or even made the effort to like say, oh, how does this work actually? The first thing I did when ChatGPT came out and I had to use it more regularly was to take two different courses, and I would recommend Elements of AI. It's a free online course by the University of Helsinki. Really great as an introduction to how it works and everything. Then I did a course in prompt engineering that I also was trained to teach afterwards on how to prompt well, because that also, of course, has a lot of input on like the results you're getting and how it works. Like understanding how it works very early on gives you an advantage later on when people are saying a lot of different things that are maybe not true or myths around LLMs, for example. There are a lot of myths out there of how it works and like how someone has a personality. People call it him or hers, like how they talk to their ChatGPT, and he said this and all this. We're humanizing something that's actually it's a typical model, right? So there's a lot of considerations there. I would recommend everyone to at least like dive in a little bit, play around with it.
Thanks a lot for that. And maybe let's move a little bit into the ecosystems collapsing megatrend. What solutions do you see? What kind of hopes do we have? Do you think that technology is gonna save us all? You know, that the famous battle between the degrowth movement, you know, of, okay, no, we need to really go back into reducing energy consumption, and then the abundance thinkers that, well, technology is gonna come and save us all. Where are you?
Yeah. In between, that's the easy place to be, but I've seen the abundance model in very practical terms not work here in Denmark. So
Not work?
yeah, not work in that sense that there was an expectation that we have invested a lot in green energy solutions and all of this, and the problem with what energy solutions do, like wind energy, which is our main driver of like green energy, renewable energy, is that it's not always the wind is not always as strong as necessary, right? Sometimes we have energy for free, or even where people get paid almost to use energy because we have an excess. Other times it's quite
Like that
expensive.
a little bit?
Yeah,
Can you
so
maybe?
it's kind of like
Yeah.
a model where, our the price of our power is changing very much dependent on where we get the power from. So the problem with wind energy is that you can't store it anywhere yet. You haven't found the ways to do that. That was the hope for the Danish government, that we will find ways to do that by 2027. Very specifically, 2027, we would have power to X technology, basically. So you could take whatever wind is blowing and use the energy, distill it into a different sort of material. So that could be hydrogen, for example, that we can store the energy in some way or form. But right now, it's just if the wind is blowing and we have energy into the grid, it's great. And if we have a lot, we even get it cheaper because there's a lot of supply and not enough demand. So you're kind of almost encouraged to use energy in those times. But when the wind is not blowing, um, we are reliant on various other sources of energy, like biofuels, for example, right? And that's we don't have as much resources in that, and it's not like unlimited, right? So it makes our prices increase because there's more of a demand than there's a supply. So that's kind of a part of the system where there are some failings still that could be very much helped by finding the right solutions to store energy, for example, that we can actually also transport it over longer distances and all this. Yeah, maybe it's a bit complicated, but in essence, it's just to say that we don't have like efficiently optimized the systems, for example, across Europe. To account for this, because we've been used to having gas from Russia come in and be our lifesaver, and not many countries still get gas from Russia across Europe, right? And that's not really an ideal situation to be in. Um, yeah, so I think what makes me optimistic is that many of the countries we think, oh, they're some of the worst polluters. They're really going in like bad direction, like China, for example. They're actually leading in renewable energy because they've been seeing the changes had on the air quality of their cities. It's cheaper over the long run. You don't have to extract anything. You can actually just plug it out of the air or from the sun or geothermal energy. Like it's a more resilient form of energy because it's not a finite in nature, right? So I think that's what makes me positive. That it's actually a better solution and it's cheaper in many ways than what we have had already. And energy is the big dilemma when it comes to the climate crisis. In many ways, of course, then we have a different problem as the food production. And for many years, we thought that we would grow as a population endlessly to be, I don't know, 20 billion people at some point. But now at least we can see with great fair level of certainty that we will like peak at 10 billion, and then things will slow down from there. That's also because our living standards have improved. So we don't, for example, women can take an education. They don't need to like have 5 kids to support themselves as a family, right? So that's part of the positive movements in that. I can recommend reading Factfulness around this. So yeah, the food production is still a problem because we have to, find ways to divert our attention away from from animal resources and meat, for example, to other forms. And I think there are a lot of different attempts to develop technology that will replicate the taste of meat and all this that is not mainstream yet, but will be eventually. And I think 20 years down the line, at least some parts of the world, we will look back and say, okay, how on earth were we able to like get ourselves to eat a living being, like a conscious being, in some ways, like a cow, for example, or like a pig. Like I think we just don't have the alternatives ready yet, but we're also already seeing a transition that there is more there, and the less steps the food production have to go through from planting a farm, like planting soya in a farm somewhere in Brazil, and then feeding cows with that soy, and then putting it on the dinner tables, but actually maybe just making the beef out of soy in the first place and adding like the like natural taste flavors. I don't know exactly. I don't know. I'm not an expert in like bioprotein, but I think that when we skip those lines of production, I think that will also be very helpful. But so in essence, I think it's about scaling these technologies, and now we're aware that something is wrong. There's a lot of investments being done into finding alternatives that I'm positive around. But the question is like, how much time do you have? What interests are at stake? There are companies that might go bankrupt because they have betted on the wrong thing, right? And they have some interest in not making that happen. So yeah, I think it's difficult topic because there's also so much more than just like CO2 emissions. It's about the nature we're living in and what happens when, let's say, one type of insect disappears from one part of the planet. We don't exactly know the butterfly effect going on there and what it means, right? We don't have that full picture of the planet we're living on. So I think that's a cause for concern. The longer we take to really revert that development we're heading towards.
Yeah, no, that's so crucial, and knowing that everything is so connected is just mind blowing. You were already mentioning the incentives of maybe old structures. Old companies have betted on systems like fossil fuels and now need to kind of make a profit out of it. Do you see a transition in incentives? Like, how do we reach that? Maybe what you're also saying about the urban new Amani, that was the city, right? That you were picturing in the Megatrend report. How do you see that develop? And maybe you can give us a little bit of a context of that city, how that city could look like.
But first off, I think it takes a lot of awareness that it's actually possible to dream up or like to envision a different society than what we're living in. I think a lot of people just disregard like straight away that it's possible to live in a different world than what we do right now, forgetting that things have changed over time again and again and again. Like we're saying with our like individual perspectives, they have changed, right? The same goes with society. We just forget. Like we forget how things used to be collectively and also individually. There's something called the shifting baseline syndrome that basically is around how our baselines for what we relate to changes over time, right? So when we talk about climate change, we talk, over the last 5 years, temperatures have increased, but not that much. But if we look on 100 years, like timeline, it's a completely different picture. So it depends a lot on also what we're measuring against. And I think that's sometimes what we're missing from the conversation, that things actually do change, and we need to understand why and how we can change it in a more positive way. Um, I like to use this model called the Bekana two loop model around how we can transition out of a dominant system in a good way and still work on the emerging system while the dominant system is being phased out. And I think that's a good way. We each have different roles to play. Some people have to be the visionaries, really coming up with the ideas of how the new system should work, but there are also stewards that should, for example, politicians that should make it easier for like the people and organizations that are part of the dominant system to phase out of that and jump onto the new system. And I think it's a really important role as a regulator. We need someone to tell us from a higher level of standpoint that what we're doing is not better for more people in the long run, right? And there needs to be the right incentives in place. I like this way of thinking around it. We need the incentives to change, and that's also how kind of the idea of new money came about. It's like a provocative scenario, a glimpse of the future. You might say that there's very much something we use in Foresight Futures. We use scenarios to kind of provoke people to, and make it more experiential, to make it feel like you're actually like walking around a new place or a new city in the future. And what does it mean for you? Like, what do you like? What don't you like? What would you change? What should you do right now to move towards that or move away from that? So it's a good way to kind of get the thinking going around futures, and it stems the idea of kind of a regenerative city like New Amani is meant to be. Comes from actually I think 5-6 years ago. I had this sudden, and I don't know, like I woke up in the morning and I thought, so we talk a lot about sustainability all the time, but what lies beyond sustainability? It seems very simple, and to talk about the bare minimum, which sustainability is. It's able to sustain itself, right? Is that really
Yeah.
is that really what we should go for as a society? I just thought that was an interesting idea. I didn't know if anything was beyond that. How can we move towards that? We have a hard time, moving towards sustainability. So how can we even move across that? But also we're at a point in time where we can't really afford too much to just be sustainable because it's becoming more and more difficult. So when we need more radical solutions, that's why I find out about the regenerative aspect of sustainability. Like how do we create, especially cities, because cities is where a lot of changes happening. How do we create cities that are more regenerative, that gives more than it takes, that are positive both on the social, environmental front, and perhaps even financially, because that's also an incentive that we need to consider, right? Yeah. So the idea for this scenario kind of came about from that work then went back when I was at the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies and the Urban Futures team. We worked with different clients, wrote reports around what could a regenerative city look like as a moonshot of our time, basically. And of course, this is very philosophical idea in context, like what does it actually mean to be regenerative? And there are examples out there of places where you're actually using what you already have, um, of a challenge to make things better in multiple different ways. So I think that's, for example, one way to be regenerative. For example, if we talk about Copenhagen, where I'm sitting right now, an example is that we have a waste plant that's also a ski slope and a climbing hill at the same time. That turns waste into water. It's vaporized, so it's not harmful for people to be on that. So it's a kind of like, it's good socially because people can enjoy and be around that. We don't have any mountains in Denmark, so it's a kind of a way to replace that, and it also does something good to the waste that's then being treated at the plant. Not sure it's fully regenerative, but at least it's a step in the right direction. We also have, because we have a lot of problems with the flooding, potential flooding. We have the municipality and have created these areas that, if in case of flooding, the water will be led to parks, for example, that are then built in spaces for containing this excess water, the drainage. And it's both a nice place to go around and during the day, and if it's flooding, it's kind of saving us also from some of the harms of the planet and so on. So
That's
um,
cool.
yeah, so for new money, I think the idea is based on a lot of the things that we're already kind of talking about right now. I think algae in it will become much more mainstream as a both it could be like we're talking about seaweed, right? I think that's shown to have a lot of good effects, but it could also be used more consciously in society. We need to find the right ways of doing that, right? How to, for example, we need something that can absorb the CO2 and preferably natural ways. And anyways, we need that. We need CO2 capture capacity, right? How can we be better at recycling our wastewater? I earlier today I talked to someone because I want to create a report around the future of utilities, which is not very sexy topic by no means, but it's the invisible infrastructure behind our cities and behind our societies. That's so important. And wastewater, for example, treatment is something that will become even more critical in the future, where we're looking into and lack of water in many ways. So it's around how can we kind of lay out our cities, our societies in ways that, where we actually think about the systems that they will thrive in. So kind of the ecosystems approach. Well, how do we kind of foster that positive aspect for both nature and for people living there? How do we create cities that makes people flourish, live good lives in a sense, and not only thinking about, we need to be in some kind of apartment building, and then when you then get a family, whatever, you move to a different one, you live at your job, and maybe you have to go 45 minutes by car to your job every day, and that's not really ideal for anyone, right? So there are a lot of different ideas already out there put together, also with potential future solutions that can make our cities a much better place to be, for people and for nature.
I think it's so fascinating to have that experiment to really think about what would a regenerative city look like, what would I like to have in a regenerative city, and that immediately brings us into acting already, into going into that direction, right? So it's because sometimes it's so overwhelming, the thought of future and future outcomes, possibilities, dooming forecasts, and then just understanding that we are also part of this, that we are actors in this, and that already having that exercise of looking into what those possibilities could actually look like and what our role could be in this direction forward, I think it's fascinating, and I think it's very much needed. I mean, I think we were talking about this just before the podcast, right? About how the relationship with emerging futures is very important. Maybe you could talk about this a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that's very important. We have agency as people. Of course, whenever you want to do something, there might be consequences, right? And it's very much easier said than done, but we do have agency. Some people more than others. But I think that's a realization we need to have. With agency, we cannot afford to stop dreaming. I think that's also a critical part, and we need to keep imagining better futures. Because otherwise, like, what's the point? Really, I think it's something people are satisfied with status quo, and also because in many ways our lives are fairly good and safe in many parts of the world. Again, important to state this. So it's become kind of like, why do we need to think of how things can be better constantly? But I think it's something that's very also motivating part of being a human is also to keep dreaming, keep imagining how things could be different. What if, what if this or if that? What if we have a regenerative city? What kind of life do I want to lead? What would be my ideal day? Yeah, I think some of these questions we stop asking ourselves. We also need to play around much more. Like, we don't have to take everything as seriously as we do. What could be a fun experiment to try out? And maybe this I'm saying this maybe from a position of privilege in many ways, because I'm a white male, right? So it's like I have a lot of privileges already, and inherently in that. But I still think that we need to kind of try things out and work our best to improve things in the way we see for ourselves, because there are people out there that have agency and are using it very consciously in what they perceive as the better future. And I think that's not the better future for everyone, but that's what they think, right? So we need to get more of a voice, and we need to start dreaming and envisioning what better lives you could have together, and then start working towards that. That's also part of what I'm motivated with Anticipate and the organization I'm trying to build, is to both make people realize that agency, but also to help them act out, what does it actually they want to do? What do they see as the solutions, the pathways to create the positive change that they envision? And not just stop at dreaming, but actually carry out some of their dreams.
Yeah. I think we were talking about the food scene in Copenhagen, going into exactly that direction, what we're just talking about. Maybe you can share a little bit about that too.
Yeah, and yes, we talked about also we both love food, right? So I think it's a natural step, but that's what happened in the food scene in Copenhagen. I don't know how well aware people are of this, but I think it was around 15, 20 years ago. A few chefs here in Denmark and kind of the ecosystem started having conversations around the kitchen here. Like, what is it really that makes the Danish kitchen the Danish kitchen? How can we maybe improve it? Because it's become very much like we eat a lot of pork, we eat a lot of potatoes, the very classic Northern European cuisine. Not very fascinating. We even imported like dishes and made them our own in very simple ways. Like, I think pasta bolognese is like the most popular dish besides rye bread here in Denmark to eat at dinner. So they asked themselves, like, how do we create a better food culture? And that kind of transpired into the New Nordic Food Manifesto, which led to restaurants such as Noma, which won the prize for best restaurant in the world several times, and also other like Michelin star restaurant here in Copenhagen. But especially interesting is how it kind of trickled down into a better food scene in general. suddenly people started caring about the food because they were seeing local ingredients being put to use in new ways that they hadn't before, right? We went back to some of the roots of what we had, but also imagined new constellations and took inspiration from the outside. I think this is a great example of someone actually in dreaming that things could be better, and food could be better because food is an essential part of being human and being social, and how it went into becoming more of like a collective movement towards creating better food systems and better eating habits in general in society. That now means that we have a lot of Michelin star restaurants. We have very good, like cheaper offerings as well. We have street food in every corner. I know that may be a trend everywhere, but I think it's led to people realizing that they have to consider what they're digesting, what they're eating, right? Yeah, and maybe we should do this for other areas as well. It could be our clothing industry, for example, fashion could use a new manifesto that actually carries out the change that we need. I know there are examples of people doing great work out there and changing this, right? It also be in a more societal level of new welfare society in Denmark, for example. Like, what does that look like? Our model is quite old, but can we kind of reinvigorate it in some way or form and find the right collaborators? Because it's something we need to do together. Of course, you can have agency as an individual, as an organization, but ideally, the best way to carry out change, both in terms of effectiveness and in terms of how good it is, will be together with others.
Yeah, definitely. Collaboration is key. And talking about food and what impact it has on us, maybe let's go into one of the things that we haven't been talking yet about health and well-being. Can you maybe explain also in your report, you mentioned that chronic illness has been growing exponentially in the past decades, I believe. Why do you think that is? And maybe can you share a little bit of the new emerging technologies that we could be seeing soon-ish?
Yeah, the reason for chronic disease, I'm not an health expert by any means, but from my understanding is because an illness like cancer, for example, it's something that that gets we have with us, all of us, but it just gets worse as our immune system deteriorates over time. So when you're old, your immune system is almost like down to zero. We don't have any protection anymore, and that means that these type of illnesses easier come to us in our bodies and impact it, right? So I think that's something to think about. That I think it's also with our eating habits that have were which brought a lot of excitement, and we've been able to import food from all over and store it and all this, but there are also a lot of harmful things in the food we eat, of like sugar levels and whatnot, that we're only realizing the ill effects of, right? And when you first get addicted to food and sugar, it's very difficult to turn around. Of course, we have Ozempic, Danish Danish product that can help you lose your weight, but it's more of like a holistic transformation that's needed, I think, of our also our food systems, but also the way we treat diseases. I think it also needs to. Our systems are very much made for when people are sick, and not so much about preventing. It's a way about sick care, not health care necessarily. I think that's another problem, that we assume people will be sick and we treat them when they are, and then they leave the hospital. Maybe they'll come back or they have another illness, right? And we still don't spend enough on prevention and how to create better lives before you might get sick, because of course some sickness and illness is inevitable. I think also, and one of the technologies that makes me positive for the future is that we're able to, on a much more individual level, understand what really goes on in our bodies, with the whole genome sequencing costing much less than it used to. We can have more personalized medicine that will actually help us specifically with the things we need and not have as many side effects compared to who we are. So, like, the understanding of the individual. And again, this is not something that everyone has access to, but over time, hopefully, it will be democratized even more. The price has already gone down very much of genome sequencing, for example. Um, that will help us live better lives. So when we're sick, we'll be treated that way, but also understanding what it is that you need to create a good life for yourself. And that way, yeah. So we've been keeping living longer lives across the world. The question is, how old can we become, and what's, is there a natural end state to the potential? I also think something around mental health has become more important as we're perhaps seeing on an overall level, and not less struggles physically, but it's kind of we have moved so far up on how well our lives are that something else that maybe we haven't had time to afford thinking to, like mental health. And as I said, I struggle with an anxiety myself, but that become more of a consequence of the lives we lead. So we need to be more aware of also the technology we use, the social media platforms. What does AI do? So understanding the blurring realities I talked about. What does that mean for our mental health? And how can we live more mindful lives? I think, in essence, that's a lot of what it's about. Yeah. So I think I'm very optimistic in terms of longevity. I think we'll live longer, better lives overall. But I also hope it's something that's not just for the few, but that will be for the many. So we not just have like designer babies, or that where we can put mix the genomes the exact right way to get the baby we want, but that is something that's actually being used to help people in worse conditions to live longer lives and longer, better lives.
No, I think that's fascinating. And I also loved the aspect when you mentioned in the report how it's right now still a privilege to see that mental well-being mental health in general is just being considered a privilege, and how we can maybe move into the future into something where it's not a privilege anymore, but in normal conditions. So I thought that was quite, I don't know, quite an intriguing thought.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to look at what has happened with mental health in general, but yeah, perhaps like if we're talking about provocative scenarios, what if you just had a personalized pill you took every single morning that will give you the vitamins and like supplements you would have, and then you could enjoy yourself with the food you were eating, right? What would that do to our relationship with health and with food, for example, and enjoyment? I think you know it's not completely far fetched. Of course, it takes a while for this to happen to everyone, but over time, I think we'll see. And I also like the openings. I think we're also understanding the progress of science, that there are new ways of treating illnesses. Like, for example, just listen to a podcast around how psychedelics is finally being used again to try to help people who haven't found like any other method to work. For example, with if they have anorexia, to kind of like deal with that mental illness, which is this, right? So there are new ways and new experiments going on a daily basis that are all leading us towards better futures. I think that's what we need to remember all the time, these breakthroughs as well.
Well, that's super fascinating as well, because what you were saying about the pill, that I don't know, there's also a part of me that I'm sometimes thinking like, oh my God, are we going a little bit too much into that direction of obsessing over the perfect health, and just, that we, now we have these Apple Watches to control and monitor how we do sports and how our sleep is. And, we have all these, suddenly we have all these tools to monitor and check our health and heart rate and all that. And sometimes I'm like, maybe that is actually making us more anxious about being and staying healthy, and did we get all the nutrients today, and all these things. And sometimes I'm not sure sometimes, what's the balance here. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And also, like, what's the point even if you're stressing out? Like, I think the best example is, I don't know if this is a myth. Maybe some people should look it up if they're really interested in this. But there's this saying that if you should only run, like if you really enjoy running, because the time you spend running will only extend your life time you have already spent running. So it doesn't really make any sense unless you enjoy it, right? Of course, you can live a better life and all of this, but so it's just like a saying. But I think it's very well representative of what it is we're doing, right? So if you want a life full of like Burger King and McDonald's every day, and fair enough. If that's a good life to you, I think that's the most important thing. But it can also be stressful because we're also seeing the best moments of everyone's lives all the time on social media. So we're like seeing the most fit people, in their best situations when they just I don't know, they just ate like a very healthy meal that they made and it looked wonderful. And it's like, why am I not doing this? And I could also do these other 5 things for my mental health. I should do yoga or mindfulness or whatever. And I think at the end of the day, it serves to stress us more than necessary. So I think like it's all with reason and balance, right? It's not obsessing over something and like doing it because you feel like you have to keep up or yeah, that there I think there's a balance in that where it's becomes unhealthy at one point. To stress so much. I'm wearing a like a runner's watch myself to, but it also I know that it sometimes stresses me out. Or I can see I haven't been moving as much as I should this week, right? I need to go out, and so it's more finding ways to use it for positive reinforcement rather than like a slap on the wrist and saying you haven't done enough at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it's super interesting what you were mentioning about the psychedelics and exploring more of that part, because I think it kind of does that work for us to connect ourselves with the roots maybe a little bit more, and also that we are, what we were saying earlier, part of nature, that we are made out of nature, that we are nature. So I don't know, in that direction, I think there's so much that we might be also rediscovering from more ancient wisdoms that I think is quite fascinating as well.
And actually, the whole ancient wisdom concept is also something that's being used quite a lot in futures work now, and it's being talked around, and there are actually workshops around our relationship with the future from a indigenous wisdom perspective, which I think is interesting because we have always thought about the future in some way or form. It's very human to do that, and in some cultures it happened in one way, in other cultures it happened a different way, often related to nature and appreciation of what nature gives us and what we like the lives we live together with nature. So that there's this concept of 7 generations that some I know indigenous communities have lived by. How what you're doing now should also benefit those 7 generations from you, right? And I think that that's like seeing things in a bigger picture. I think that's generally something I hope to to see more of. That we're not just like suddenly humans didn't suddenly come about like 20 years ago and then we just live lives like we've always done, but actually realizing that there are a lot of things that we can learn from the past as well, and from different ways of doing things and trying things out. I think we're in a good condition to do that.
That's very cool that a lot of future work is now also done with ancient traditions infused. Quick question about your work also with organizations. How does that work look like? What do they need mostly?
Yeah, what they need is different from what I can provide. I would say what they need is someone to tell them what the future is going to be. And that's also a question I get all the time at family parties, at conferences, meeting my neighbor out in the hallway when they hear I'm a futurist. Like, what's the future going to be like? Where's your crystal ball? All this. That's very difficult for me to answer because I can't predict the future, right? I can say, knowing what we know now, and imagining how things could transpire, I could say that there is a reasonable probability, a possibility that this or this could happen, right? But there's a lot of things that will happen that I probably haven't realized, yeah. So that's something they want, that kind of false sense of certainty that I can tell them exactly what's going to happen. That's also why I was a bit uh, divided and whether making a megatrends report be the right way, because a lot of people see it as just a matter of fact. This is how the future is going to look. No, it's a talking point. It's a discussion paper. It's a contextualizing change. It's not to say that the future will look in this or that exact way. We're talking about big changes, global forces a very big level, right? And they can look in all sorts of different ways in different places, and they'll inspire differently. But it's just a way to kind of make sense of whatever is happening. And there's a lot in the translation piece of what does this mean for me or my organization. And that's also part of what I do and anticipate help organizations translate, for example, megatrends or signals or indications of the future into something that's more tangible for them that they can actually respond to and react to in a sense. So that's a lot of the part of it. I think it's also Foresight is very much used as a both an insurance policy in some ways. So you can do your forecast and all your data and analytics. You can do insights work and all this, but we need to come sometimes also expand perspectives a bit, look up and look out, and see what's beyond our own industry, our own sector, and not just look at the data, because data is very much like driven from something that's already happened in the past, but it might not look at the same in the future. So kind of giving that, it's not a full insurance because you're not going to be covered when something goes wrong, but at least you have already given some thought to what could happen. That will put you in a better place when, if the thing happens down the line. And it's something, it's a lot about the process and the thinking exercise of thinking about different possible scenarios that we think out there and our response to them. And I think that's very important for organizations to have that perspective, because the world keeps changing, the society keeps changing, and if you're only looking at your competitors and what they're doing right now, you might at some point be blindsided by someone else. Like look at the like how the taxi industry was just blindsided completely by someone like Uber, who came in from nowhere, it seemed, because they saw like a hole in the market for how to do it more conveniently. Of course, a classic example, talking about Uber, but because it might as well happen in other industries like health, for example, where complete new companies have come in and become a competitor to established ones, right? Uh, the people who make smartwatches are competing actively with the people who are, the pharma companies who are producing medicine and living off of that. So I think it's that perspective as well. And then I think and speaking very much in like a millennial Gen Z, but it's also about the FOMO and avoiding FOMO, um, and fear of missing out on new things, new opportunities. There's so much happening outside, so you need to have that perspective, and getting that external lens in is really good. And what I do, and I wouldn't call myself expert in any industry really. Of course, I have worked across insurance, energy sector, but in cities, democracy, a lot of different topics, media even. And that's given me like a good solid toolbox, but I'm a generalist. So I could come in as the expert in the methodology and the tools, and then I work with the companies and with the experts, with the sitting out there, knowing a lot about the industry, a lot about what they need to do. They have so much information, getting that out on paper, on the table, discussing with colleagues, like fostering that conversation, so you end up not having the same FOMO because you actually had the conversation already about what could happen and so on. So I do provide, for example, research as well, but my main part is facilitating other people to envision how the future could look and what they should do today to respond to those futures. Yeah, and
Okay.
I always tend to forget, but it's like the classic consultancy toolbox, from longer processes where we work on like a new strategy, for example, to training programs, how like courses on the ways and methods and like how to think about this and how to use megatrends and all this, to workshops and keynotes and research pitches, and even like immersive concepts like a field trip, futures field trip to a different place to meet organizations that are innovative already, that are doing things differently. Yeah, so it's a lot of different things, but all around how we can use the future as a tool for change.
That's really interesting. And would you say that our organization's scared of what's coming, especially with now such a pace of change? Or do you think they're not even aware that much?
I think they're aware, but a lot of them choose to put their head in the sand and just say, okay, this will pass. Or I've heard people say in the last few weeks at like a workshop I've held, yeah, we don't know what Donald Trump is going to do anyway, so you might as well not do anything about it. And I think that's not the right strategy, because the man Donald Trump, he's actually said he would do a lot of these things. People just haven't listened because he didn't do them last time he was president, perhaps. Uh, there are always things you can pick up on and talk about and discuss. And I think it's easier, it's more convenient to say, well, things are changing too fast for us to keep up anyways. We're just gonna, stay on the grind, focus on our own thing. Which is, of course, that's one strategy. You can do that. But how long can you do it for? That's really the question. I think like a lot of people are like have been in crisis mode, transition mode since the start of COVID. Uh, and they still haven't really popped up on the other side and say, okay, what do we need to do? I meet a lot of organizations that are constantly in transformation, digital transformation, organizational transformation, and I think that's in somewhat a healthy process, because you're trying to be fit for purpose, but you never end up actually necessarily serving what you're trying to serve in terms of your products and services or the things you deliver, right? Yeah, so I think that's the whole being in crisis mode all the time. It makes you perhaps more resilient, but it doesn't really give you the wiggle room. Just spending like, I don't know, 5-10% of your time to actually think a bit ahead, and maybe at some point come out of this crisis mode that you're in constantly, right? Because if you're constantly like extinguishing fires, like how can you ever look to what's going on in a different part of the city, right? In different neighborhood completely. You don't have time for that, because that's all everyone is focused on that. And then you need to kind of jump and find new solutions, and that's what every like company that survived for a long time has done, right? They've been able to like reorient when it's been needed.
And what kind of companies would you say are the future? What kind of fields also would you suggest going into the direction of?
That's a very I never that's a really good question. Never thought about that or heard that question before. Actually, I think that's super interesting. So, to which kind of companies? I think it's those that are willing to take bets. Not to say that you should spend all your time thinking about the future, because that will not necessarily be very productive, but at least be able to have multiple different that are brave enough to try multiple different things at the same time, so in different time horizons and different um, industries, trying to broaden the scope, diversify your portfolio of products, and think about it, your organization as a organization of portfolios. Also being able to step out and fail a bit. I think that's from these organizations are huge systems that work to survive in a sense. That's kind of the idea of an organization, or like a company. You're supposed to grow and you're supposed to survive, right, over a long time. And that's what the whole system is made around. Um, but asking the tough questions, I think if organizations are able to do those, they will also realize that maybe a lot of what they do is not necessary, is not needed in the way or form they do it. Um, but it's going to be difficult to again come up with the question like, what would put your business out of business tomorrow, and what should we perhaps focus on, and what shouldn't we focus on, and what can we do to position ourselves better, not 1 year from now, but down the line, and what experiments can we put in place, what bets can we place to really like find the future of for our organization. Not to say that everything should be turned around every second year, but just having that look out and saying that what is that we actually need to do if we are honest to ourselves. It might be inconvenient, it might be uncomfortable, but if we are honest to ourselves, like what is it we need to do differently? So the companies that ask themselves those tough questions, I think, and that are more flexible with their business model and thinking business models, not just in the services they provide or the products. Like what is it kind of delivery model we want? Are we looking? Where can we take inspiration from and maybe improve um, our own business, right? Not seeing people always as competitors, but also sources of inspiration. Right?
So you see also maybe more autonomy inside of organizations. Do you see that trend shifting from hierarchical into a little bit more organic, autonomous, structured transition?
I think there's a reason in some organizations for a hierarchy, but I do believe that there are other ways of leading. Seen a lot and read a lot about like different sorts of self-leading teams or new models for that whole approach. I'm very much a believer in the cooperative movement as well, where you, as an employee, have a stake in what's being like, what is the future for a company on a wider level. There's the Mondragon Collective in the Basque Country in Spain. I've been quite a lot in the Basque Country, so I'm very familiar with their approach, and they do a lot of like public-private partnerships, but also they have this collaborative model of cooperatives, and that's in like implicit part of the system that's really important to them. And I think that has a lot of value, that actually people get rewarded for how much responsibility they want to take. There's more of a flexibility in terms of what you want to develop. So the Mondragon like umbrella has a lot of different brands and companies underneath it that is meant to ripple off each other, but also solve different problems in society. And I think that's a good way to start. Yeah, because of like also knowing my generation and the generations coming after, it seems like responsibility might be something that there's more interest in, but only if there's a like kind of a positive influence of it. Like what's in it for me? That culture, I think, is becoming more like pervasive. So I think you need to rethink your whole model. Again, what is actually what people want, and not just what we have done before, and maybe more organic models as part of that system. It's a good question.
And also the sector. I mean, we've been looking into health, into food, into energy, AI, tech, I guess. But then also there are already these tech giants. Is there any more room? What do you see?
Yeah, but for example, in Europe, I think there will be plenty of room because it seems like we're moving towards like the Fed United States of Europe anytime soon. A preposterous thought, again, something that was never imaginable, like right after Brexit 10 years ago, or like around Brexit 10 years ago. No one would ever think that would be the way we were going, because it seemed like it was fragmenting completely. But for example, for European tech companies, there's a lot of potential now, and really like asserting yourself and becoming the one company in the scene. I think, yeah, it's a difficult question which industries to focus on. There's some things that will always be necessary, like food, for example. That it's just meant to sustain ourselves. Energy, of course, as well. Um, and it's a difficult topic. Maybe it's even easier just to go at it from like the most basic human needs. What is that we always have needed and want in life? Is it to, like, for example, to look good, to be, not to say that beauty is the right sex to focus on necessarily, but there are other ways around it. We want to be healthy. I think health in other ways than maybe just like medicine and pills is always good. Yeah, it's a good question. At one point that I did a talk in front of like a small audience, and one of the first questions someone asked me, uh, so he assumed I would be rich because I'm a futurist, so I would of course know what would happen in the future. And he didn't ask me if I was rich, by the way, which I'm not. Well, at least relative to Danish standards, but he just assumed that because obviously I would use my skills in terms of what he saw as predicting the future, which I'm not doing, in like making a better life for myself that way. And it actually got me thinking a bit. Yeah, there are some industries that I believe more strongly in the future. Of course, also very much dependent on what we're seeing right now with securitization. It's easy to say, well, NATO, we need to have 5% of GDP allocated to defense across NATO. That's a huge investment across many different countries. So clearly, the defense industry must be a great one. Cybersecurity, the same. All these like defense seems that we're moving towards securitization. That might even be like its own megatrend, but maybe it's within emerging world order. It's not the greatest answer. I think another way is, so how can we, in a more positive spin, emulate nature? How can we use some of the things that we see in nature by mimicry to create new products and services that are more healthy for us, because it's made out of what we are made out of as well, organic material. That's maybe more of a positive spin instead of talking about the defense industry and how we need to invest in weapons and yeah.
It's part of our reality right now, so it's definitely worth to talk about it. It's our reality. What kind of paradigm shift would you say you see is happening around organizations, maybe on nation levels, individual levels, and yeah, going already into closing this conversation, what kind of paradigm shift do you see is already maybe emerging, and maybe also what we could even foster a little bit even more in towards the future?
I think I think there is a realization that we are on a planet that's not just gonna exist. Like, or it's not. We're not gonna exist without it necessarily. Um, I think that's like the climate consciousness. It's not to say that it's fully materialized in our ways of doing things necessarily, and you can see with like recent regulations being rolled back in the EU, for example, that and the whole Trump. I don't have to mention that again, but he's talking about oil again. There are of course counter movements. There are always counter trends to any trends we're seeing, even these megatrends. But I think like there's a more collective consensus that we're actually understanding the climate change is not something that someone made up, and that's taken a long time. I remember watching. Now I can't remember the Inconvenient Truth, the Al Gore movie back 20 years ago, and like hearing about these things, and it felt so far removed from everything we've been seeing. Now, of course, I was scared and nervous about what it's going to mean, but didn't really feel real. But now when you're hearing about temperature records in one way or form being set every single month in all around the world, we're seeing like massive climate events, all this, it's hard not to realize that something is not right. So I think that's at least that factor that we all are working in the same direction in that way. It's positive. Also, that it's good business, right? It just doesn't have to be a cost to protect ourselves against climate. It's something that can be incentivized for people to work towards if they're not convinced already enough by the mission itself. Yeah, it's maybe a bit more of a cynical perspective towards it, but I think that's necessary in the system we're in right now. When with the dominant system hopefully being replaced by an emergent system at some point, we need the stewards to take us into different form, and that needs incentives to play. Yeah, I also think it's very hard. I want to speak about positive things, but I think I think the whole leveling out through AI, both in terms of how they can democratize access to creativity, or like expressing yourself, or writing and all that, which is great, but also how things have become more the same, and we're basically reperpetuating like old ways of doing and seeing things. I think very to a large extent not very like considerate or intentional in any way, but still is happening. So the whole uniqueness of people are slowly moving away. So at some point, and that's something I'm fearing, that we become this big blob, right? That's just we'll see the same things and produce the same things. But I do also still believe in human creativity and ingenuity. We'll find our ways around that. And it's not something that I'm hopeful around. But it is a cause for concern. Like, what does it do to us? Like, sometimes I have used AI and I'm thinking this would have taken me 5 seconds to think about, but I'm just gonna ask just because I've gotten used to it, and that's something I don't want to do. I want to maintain. Maybe it's a bit of like a conservative preservationist perspective, but I want to like stay human and who I am, and with my attention span decreasing, I want to try to fight that as well in the long run. So that's maybe a yeah. I think there are some realizations in society that some of the things we're doing are not great for us, and also the things we're not seeing very directly. It's easier to look at a broken arm than broken soul in very dark terms. But that there is more to it than just what we're like using and seeing, consuming, to being human as well. There's more to it. We do have spirituality as well, or there are other ways of doing things. Like I read that the other day. I don't know if that's positive or negative, but there's an increase in young people in Denmark, going to church again. So
Is an increase.
yeah, like after a
In-
year, like I think it's been ongoing trend for like decades that there's been less and less and less, also on a general population level. But
yeah.
that has flipped. It's not to say that 80% of young people go to church, but it's more than it used to be. So yeah, I think that's like search for meaning. I think that's something that I see as paradigm shift that could potentially lead to quite big change in society. Be it spiritually, through religion, or through like a relationship with nature, mental health, and eating well, and like workout or whatever. But I like what is the meaning of being a person 2025 and in the future?
Yeah, it connects a little bit to what we were saying earlier, right? What's the purpose of life as well, and our personal purpose. And so imagine we have a teenager listening to us. What would you recommend them focusing on now that they're approaching graduation? What, how would they know what to do next?
I think the first thing is don't stress about what your future is gonna be, because things will find their way. I just talked to someone else today who had been studying, and then she's been working for years. She was a bit, what do I want to do with my life? I'm aging, and she was 26, and I was like, take it easy, take it easy. Like you have plenty of time. I know some of my friends who are older than me as well. It's taken them years to find their path, right? But I think it's just keep being curious and explore things. And sometimes things happen as you see like an internship posting right at the time where you are looking for what you want to do, and you apply for it and you get it, and then the whole life trajectory is changed, right? So it can be very yeah, life can be very overwhelming. And I think it's easy, it's good to say that everyone has been through this kind of like internal struggle, of existential struggle. What do I want to do with my life? And people are still going through that even though they're adults. It's not something that will just go away. It just seems very big right now because you have the whole world in front of you, right? And you have to live for a long time. And I think the thing is to say that you just never stop changing it. Like you always change over time. Your identity will change, what your interests are, and that's completely okay. I think that's also exciting about the future. Like our perspective on the future changes from one day to the next. So tomorrow my answers might have been different depending on what I ate this tomorrow morning or whatever, right? So that's also the fascinating thing, that life is variation to it. And I think, yeah, as long as you, and again, it's easier. It's not to say that I've had an easy path to get here, because being entrepreneur is not easy in many ways. But if you really are curious about something and passionate, then I think things will find a way and explore that curiosity. And it's okay not to, go path of like university or whatever if you're really interested in this cooking, because we also need chefs. And if that's what makes you happy, I think that's also a point. I don't think wealth, for example, is about money necessarily. I think it's about so much more. We just tend to forget it because it seems like the ideal everyone strives towards. Also, working in and being in the entrepreneurship community, of course, a lot of people are motivated by making like big bucks at the end of the day. And I don't think that's what life necessarily is about. What is it? Don't be the richest person in the churchyard. That's by money, at least. There's no point to that. So yeah, I think it's like try things out, experiment, and try get new experiences. Yeah, and do something out of your comfort zone. Of course, not something completely reckless, but yeah, that's what I think. It's
One note on this, because you were saying that being rich is not equal to being wealthy. Can you expand on this?
Yeah, of course, again, coming from a position of privilege, I think that's very important, that's stated many times, that I speak from my perspective, and that's a certain perspective, right? And of course, I have everything I can ask for, and I've been very lucky in that regard. But I also found out, when you don't have necessarily income next month, that you can live off less than you expect, and it's not. Of course, it gives you possibilities and opportunities to be rich, but I think it's like the border of where it makes your life happy is if you make more than 100,000 euros a year, then there's no you will just flatline from there, right? So of course that's also being rich if you make 100,000 euros a year, I would say, but still there's a lot more richness in experiences and trying things out and like exploring the world. It doesn't have to be that you travel far away, but exploring your neighborhood or your country or whatever it is. Yeah, I don't think I talk about wealth polarization, and that's very much wealth in the accumulated money kind of sense. But there's a lot more to life than being rich.
I think that's a beautiful way to go towards the end. Maybe do you want to leave a question for the listeners? What can
The one thing I always ask myself in interviews is that what's the one uncomfortable question you haven't asked yourself? Like, that you don't want to ask yourself, but that actually is what you need to ask yourself.
Can I ask which one would that be?
That's unfair. I was blindsided with that one. I think it's around then my AI usage where I talk differently than I preach, and I'm very much a believer in practice what you preach. So really need to take a look at what I do in that regard. Yeah, and look at the trade-offs of what it is I'm really doing with AI. There is something there that I haven't fully come to terms with. Yeah, I think that might be mine. My very uncomfortable question to myself, like why are you using AI the way you're using it? Yeah, but it's a tough one, right? It's
It's a
also
super tough one.
yeah.
I think it's a very good question because I think I had to come to these terms too and ask myself, why am I not doing the podcast that I really want to do? And allowing yourself to even ask yourself that question, I think is super important. And I think it's a beautiful thing to really ask ourselves, okay, what is the question that we are too afraid asking ourselves? And I think, yeah, because if I hadn't asked myself that question, we wouldn't be sitting here now.
Yeah, proofs is a good question. Yeah.
Okay, I know that two more questions. I know that you were saying that you don't have a crystal ball, but since this is called New World in the Making, one question is, how would you see this new world developing in 10 years, and what is the new world in the making right now?
This is one of my favorite quotes. I'm not sure it's attributed to anyone or in particular. Please just send a message if I'm wrong, but we have to change either by disaster or by design, and I think that's it's quite putting things on the line on the edge and saying, okay, there's like we move and we change as society, right? But we have to be much more is more on a much more transformative level now. Um, and I think that's something that a lot of people have opened their eyes to, considering what's been happening in the US, because it seems like overnight our world looks different. That I'm not sure it does. I think, yeah, there are a lot of conflicts going on around the world, and it seems like we were like approaching the end of conflicts or even the end of nation states as some way of form, and now we're going in the other direction. And I think that's quite telling. Funny thing is, we managed to build out our systems so we have very very high levels of global interdependence. Right? You have Russia, which is actively at war with Europe, I would say, still providing gas, which is a fundamental resource to many European countries. And I think that's very telling of the state we're in, right? That we are relying on each other. We are still everyone is human. And I think we can't just destroy the interrelation that we built over the past many years, right? So something about that, I think, in that perhaps we're just seeing right now, like a disruption in our timeline, and we will go back into a state of increased global reliance, because ultimately we are all humans. It's pretty stupid that we keep fighting in essence, but of course we're not rational beings, as I also said before. So yeah, I hope to see a new world in the making where we have more female leaders, because look how many female dictators that are out there, and not many, I can tell you. I think that's something we need more of. But of course, it also takes giving away some power, and that's something that a lot of people have a hard time doing, where they are sitting, right? So maybe it's more on a hopeful level that I think and hope that this kind of shock we've been through now will make us realize we need to do things differently in the future. And of course, it's not to say in any way that World War II was a great war in any way, but it did bring a moment of reflection in terms of what we were doing. Like, Europe was actually actively at war within itself 80 years ago, which is pretty wild to think of when we're talking about. I talked about the United States of Europe now, right? So it's quite short timeline here, and I think we need to remember history and need to remember that things can look differently than what they do today and what did they yesterday, tomorrow.
Beautiful. That is very true. That, yeah, I think also you put it in the report. We sometimes underestimate what comes in the short near future, and overestimate what comes in the near future and underestimate what comes in the a longer term future. I think it was like that, no? Related to technology.
I
So I
think,
think
yeah, it's a quote by Bill Gates, actually. I think, yeah,
no,
how we overestimate the impact of technology in the short run and overestimate it in the long run. But I think underestimate in the long run. But I think it applies for many things. We just don't see it because it's like when it's a long, slow movement, it seems like all of a sudden it just pops up when it's finally here and it's ready to be used. The same with AI, right? It seems like all of a sudden something happened with AI. We just flipped the switch, but in reality, it's been years of science and a lot of hard work from a lot of people who've been moving towards this stage. So that's something we need to bear in mind.
beautiful. Do you have anything else that you would like to share before?
I feel like I'm very close to being talked out, or what you can call it. I feel like I talked a lot, but no,
We
it's
covered a lot. We definitely covered a lot. Thank you so much for joining. And it was a really very insightful conversation. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I think it's a really cool podcast, and I think we need people to dream and to do stuff like this and envision new worlds, and what is it that we can move towards, right, and not away from.
100% agree. This is what we're here for. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adriana.
Bye.